Good afternoon, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Museum of Public Relations. Today's program is being put on by the Communicator team of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., the place where news happens. I'm Danny Selnick, the chair of the Communicators team and a member of the club's Board of Governors. Before I take everyone's ticket to gain entrance to the museum, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. We're pleased to have quite a number of guests joining us today, so please, let me tell you a little bit about the National Press Club. The National Press Club was founded in 1908 and today provides a unique professional network, exclusive events with high-profile newsmakers, cutting-edge educational programming to advance your career, and a welcoming social club in the heart of downtown DC. The club's membership is comprised of journalists who work for international and national news agencies, radio and TV stations and networks, industry news publications, and social media organizations, as well as communicators who are employed by companies and government agencies, public relations firms, and independent practitioners. The Communicator team organizes many activities for the club's communicator members, and these include professional development sessions like the one we're hosting today, as well as dinners and receptions to promote networking and camaraderie with other communicators and reporters, editors, producers who are all journalist members of the club. Of course, most of these events, including today's, are now being held virtually because of the limited number of people inside the club during the pandemic. So if you aren't currently a member of the National Press Club, we encourage you to consider joining, even out-of-towners who can have non-resident memberships. You'll be supporting journalism, a profession that many public relations practitioners started their careers, as well as press freedom and educational opportunities for journalists and communicators. So be sure to go to the Press Club's website at www.press.org to learn more about joining the club and how to take advantage of the many benefits the club provides to its members. We're now starting the 5th month of this virtual Lunch and Learn program. And of course, we had hoped to be at the club, but like the rest of the world, we're just, we're hoping to return to regular business so that we could hold these meetings in person and foster what we've been talking about here. Under the Washington, D.C.'s Phase 2 reopening guidelines, there continues to be a restriction on large in-person meetings, but the club is open for limited activities in smaller groups where rooms can be rented and food for takeout and limited seating from the Reliable Source restaurant. All visitors are expected to follow the club's new health and safety procedures, which are also posted on the website. Any reservations are required. One last thing, we'll be monitoring questions in the chat room. And depending on your question, if it pertains to an item that we're looking at, I'll try to get your questions answered right away or at the end of the tour. Well, now let's get on with the tour. But I first have a 2-minute short film provided to me by the museum to show you.
In every country in the world, scenes of American industry are classic symbols of an economic system which is admired, envied, or feared, but about which not everything is known. Viewing the superlative opulence of the American standard of living, many forget that in the American capitalist democracy, no industry can prosper long without the consent of the consumer. And the thought of the economics of any business dealing with the U.S. public is the engineering of the public's consent. The men who watch over this delicate and important relationship of public and business call themselves public relations counselors. Their profession, America's youngest, is the practice of public relations. These men themselves are seldom in the public eye, but those who report the nation's affairs by word or picture know them well. And businessmen who pay them generously for their advice have learned that it is often worth its weight in gold. Though skilled in the use of advertising and publicity, their chief concern is to encourage common sense statesmanship in interrelations of business, government, labor, and public. Every routine is designed to save a busy man's time. For Deering has learned to delegate to his staff much of the detail work which otherwise would bog him down.
Have someone make me a 10-page digest of this book. If it's any good, I'll read it myself.
All right. And Mr. Myers wants you to be a board meeting too.
Tell him I'll be there. Right. Get me a plane reservation to Denver. And see what we have on Colorado.
A few days later, a special train takes off from Chicago on a streamlined junket to Aspen, loaded with reporters and photographers who have been promised a week's outing with everything on the house.
Wow. Wow. Wasn't that great? I'm really now pleased to introduce our tour guide and founder of the Museum of Public Relations, Shelley Spector. Shelley will be showing us a number of incredibly interesting pieces, but with the most incredibly stories behind them. So without any further ado, Shelley, please take us away in history.
Thank you so much, Danny. So glad to have everybody joining us today for a brief tour of the Museum of Public Relations. We're standing here now, 85 Broad Street in Manhattan. Of course, the museum has had to be closed to visitors since March. Normally, we would have about 1,000 visitors a year, a lot of students, educators, researchers from around the world. And as Danny may have told you in his note earlier, this is the world's only Museum of Public Relations, although there are many countries now, including India, that are looking to create their own Museum of Public Relations, and I hope they do. So this museum here has about 2,500 or more artifacts that include about 600 books, many of them from Bernays' own home. And it was through Bernays that the museum got started in 1995. Well, my husband and I, Barry, who's behind the camera, he and I met Bernays accidentally in 1985. And when we realized that nobody was doing any videos of him, any oral histories, we said, damn, we've got to start going up and visiting him. He was a young man then compared to what he was later. He was 94 when we first met him. And then he lived until 103 and a half. At some point, Bernays asked us to start a museum of public relations in New York City, and that he would provide some of the founding materials to start the museum with. No money, just materials. So we started going up to his house 3 to 4 times every year for the next 10 years. And here's a picture of his last birthday. I schlepped my office up to Cambridge, Massachusetts to give him his 103rd birthday party. You see, when Bernays was 85, 90, 95, 100, the entire town of Boston and the mayor and the governor would come and celebrate with him. That's how important a celebrity he was in Massachusetts. By the time he was 103, he'd sort of been forgotten. So my office came up and lit a cake. And the next scene here is that we had put 104 candles on this cake, which was a bad idea. I didn't think ahead. And when I lit the cake, the entire cake went on fire. So we eventually got it out, and thereafter, Bernays died about 2 months after that. And then when he died, he left us a lot of the material that you see here in this room. So I'm going to go first with this desk and some of the things we have on it. One of the most important things in this desk is Bernays' inbox. And this inbox is filled with all of the materials that it had in it on the very day he died. And so it's kind of, from a research point of view, it's very interesting to find the kinds of things that he felt important to have in his inbox. Incidentally, students today have no idea what an inbox is, a physical inbox. They think it's just the thing that was created for their desktops. But what was on the top of his inbox was this story or this article he had written for the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. And he was talking about his uncle, Sigmund Freud. A lot of people don't know that Sigmund Freud was his double uncle. So Bernays' mother was Freud's sister. Bernays' father's sister was married to Freud. So that is why, if you've ever wondered, in Bernays' definition of public relations, he calls public relations an applied social science. And when we speak to students or younger professionals, when they begin looking at the social science roots of this business, I think they get a much deeper appreciation for what we do. Now, the film you just saw was created in 1947, and there's absolutely no records that we can find about it. But knowing Bernays as we knew him, I think that he was all over this film. And that was created, we think, for the launch of the PRSA. And we also have this brochure that was created. And the question here might be very familiar to those of you who are members of PRSA, because they're asking here in 1947 what the definition of public relations is. And they've done many efforts since then and crowdsourcing to see what everybody thinks public relations is. But I think if you look through this book, which has a lot of names that were very famous at the time, including Garrett, who was the CCO of GM, Rex Harlow, Philip Leslie, who I believe was a very well-known textbook writer. The shortest and tightest definition is by Bernays himself. And he says, public relations is a two-way responsibility to inform the public and interpret the public to the client, which I think is a great definition and great way to think about it these days, especially when students are looking at public relations as just social media and really having nothing to do with news, generating news, which is a particularly frustrating thing for those of us who've been around a little while. So it's because we've been around a little while and because students today have no idea what public relations people did 100 years ago, or even 40 years ago, 30 years ago, before the internet. We keep this office, we keep this desk set up much like a desk would be set up 100 years ago. So we have a 1904 manual typewriter, which the students love to play with. And when I asked them, well, if you typed out a press release on this typewriter, how would you get it out to editors? There's no networking cord here. There's no email, and it flummoxed them. They can't figure it out. So then we start getting into a conversation about using the mail, which they've never thought about doing for press releases. And then later on with the inventions like PR Newswire and Business Wire. This, of course, is a telephone from 1904, which is something that both Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays had on their desks. And by the way, this is a lamp from Eddie's own desk. And this is his famous oil portrait. And there's a very similar oil portrait painted of him the same day that now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. So if we look at other things that happen to be on this desk that belong to Eddie, it's this cylindrical record from Thomas Edison. And some of you may know that Bernays and Edison had a strong relationship formed for the 1929 Lights Golden Jubilee. And we'll show you a picture of one of the souvenirs from the Lights Golden Jubilee, which was launched in 1929, right before the Great Depression. And it included Henry Ford and President Hoover, as well as Thomas Edison. And this is a souvenir that they handed out. So this is a souvenir, it's a replica of Thomas Edison's original invention of the light bulb from 1879. So this itself was made much later in 1929, but it was a souvenir that was handed out that day because it was a spectacular day. It talked about public relations in it talked about America's capitalism, technological innovation. It was a huge, huge deal. You had the Rockefellers there. You had Madame Curie there. You had just anybody who was anybody in the fall of 1929 at this great event in Detroit. So obviously a week later or so, the market tanked and people stopped talking about the Lights Golden Jubilee. We have here a call box from Western Union, which we found in one of Bernays's drawers. He had it here not because it was operating, but because it was his own souvenir for all the work that he did for Western Union. And one of the things that he told the president of Western Union was the best way to get Western Union connected as the world's premier telegraph companies, and remember back then there were a lot of telegraph companies, is to have people give speeches. And when they're talking about getting a telegram, they should always say it's a Western Union telegram. So that's how, and Western Union wasn't even the largest at that time. On this desk is a banana stapler. Why, you may ask, does Bernays have a stapler in the shape of a banana? Some of you know that he worked for many years for United Fruit, selling Chiquita bananas and positioning it as the kind of health food for babies because of all the potassium that it has. It probably has more potassium than any other food. So additionally on this desk, we have this very, very famous pipe. Did not belong to Bernays, it belonged to Paul Garrett. Arthur Page. And we're very, very familiar now with who Arthur Page is and the Arthur Page Society. And so this is the pipe that you see in a lot of the pictures of Page and his ashtray. One of my favorite things on this desk that of course did not belong to Bernays, and this is really a piece of public relations history, is through the biographer of Ivy Lee, who is the other father of public relations, we discovered that Ivy Lee in 1928 wrote a manuscript that he intended to be published. So this in 1928, this is from Ivy Lee's typewriter, and he wrote a book called The Publicity Book, Mr. Lee's Publicity Book. And you can see here that, of course, the typewriter ribbon was in green, and you can see here his red marking up. This whole book we eventually published so people could read it because it's pretty brilliant. One of the funny things that we find in there is that in 1928, Ivy Lee was himself complaining about media cover clutter out in the streets of New York. Now, back then, of course, what did you have? You really didn't even have radio. You had newspapers, you had lots and lots of newspapers, and you had billboards, and you had telegrams and phone calls. And imagine what Ivy Lee would think about the world today. Additionally, what we found in the archives was Ivy Lee, his address book from 1929. And you can see here, there's a full page of Rockefellers. The Rockefeller family, of course, was Ivy Lee's first and very big client, and that will come into play. You'll hear a little bit more about Ivy Lee and Rockefeller at the end of this show today. So, what do we have next? Okay, when Bernays was 26 years old, he was chosen by Woodrow Wilson to go over and do the publicity for the Paris Peace Treaty for the end of World War I. And then when he came back home, he was hired by the War Department to try to educate American businesses to hire vets. And these are the original, very, very delicate mats. What's that?
These are copies.
Oh, these are copies. I'm sorry. These are not the originals. These are copies. The originals extremely delicate, and they've been kind of falling apart, but you could see here the copies that we have of them. And hopefully we can begin to digitize this very, very important work that is not seen in any textbooks, and students today never learn about this kind of work from Bernays or the work of Ivy Lee. The reason that people think that Edward Bernays was more important than Ivy Lee. One of the reasons is, first of all, Ivy Lee died early on. He died in 1934 from a brain tumor. Bernays went on to live, as I said before, to age 103 and a half, and he wrote 12 books. This, by the way, is his autobiography. And it's a really wonderful book because it talks about all his famous campaigns like Bacon and Eggs, Ivory Soap, Mack Trucks. And by the way, if you go to the museum website, which is at prmuseum.org, you can see a lot of these videos. These are the interviews I was talking about earlier when Barry and I decided to start going up to his house in 1986 and videotaping him. So we have Bernays talking pretty succinctly about all of these campaigns and the research that he did. They're very entertaining. They are downloaded. I know one of them was downloaded 26,000 times last year, Bacon and Eggs. And so if any of you go into the classroom, feel free to use these tapes. Okay, so another very important person who has granted us we've acquired the archives of Harold Burson, who passed away, I guess, a year ago, this past January. God, it seems longer ago. One of the things that we found that was most interesting, and we have lots of stuff, like, Harold gave us his Burson Marsteller teddy bear. We have lots of pictures of letters that were written to Harold by George Bush and by Reagan, and we have his gold anvil. What Barry is showing you now is a letter that was handwritten personally to Harold Burson. And it's very rare that you find a president of the United States who is writing a personal letter to a public relations person. But public relations was really once held in much higher esteem. And I'll get to that in a minute. But in the meantime, we know that Harold was working as a writer and reporter during the war. And he even covered, as a reporter for the armed services, the Nuremberg trials. So we found this letter that Harold handwrote to a business partner of his before he went into the war. And one of the things that he talks about is that his idea is to create an industrial PR firm, a B2B PR firm. This was one of the first times anybody just went and created a B2B, specifically B2B PR firm. And he says, what I wanted to do is I want to merge with an advertising company. So I want to be able to offer our clients both advertising and publicity. So this is really the first time we think that it's in writing what Harold's dream was, to have an advertising agency along with the PR firm. He eventually met Bill Marsteller through some common friends at Life magazine, and the rest is history. Okay, so one of our very important missions at the museum is to kind of rewrite history. The way history has been written for public relations students is you have three white guys who invented public relations. You have P.T. Barnum, you have Edward Bernays, you have Ivy Lee, and that's the end of it. So when you ask students to this day, who founded PR, they'll tell you P.T. Barnum and Ivy Lee and Bernays. But through our research over the past 25 years, we've discovered a lot of PR people, diverse PR people who need to be mentioned and their stories told. And we've gone back all the way back to the 19th century. And we have a collection of anti-slavery newspapers that our students, our diverse students, love seeing. There were lots and lots of these being written. And one down there even has an original illustration of Frederick Douglass. So we think it's very important for public relations people today to know that they had ancestors in this business who looked like them. One of them was Inez Kaiser. Inez Kaiser was the first African-American woman to open a PR firm, which she did in 1957. And of course, she should be in the textbooks, and we're trying very hard to work with authors and textbook publishers to make sure that she and other people like Ophir Dukes are in those textbooks. Their stories are being told because diverse students today really need role models. So one of the things that we found when Rick Kaiser was, after Inez Kaiser passed away at the age of 98 in 2016, Rick Kaiser, her son, gave us her artifacts. And this is one of her most famous campaigns. She wrote a cookbook and tried to sell the cookbook and called it Southern Cooking. But then she came up with a new name for it. She called it Soul Food. And producers at the Today Show got wind of it. She went on the Today Show and was interviewed about soul food with Barbara Walters. This was in 1965 or so. So pretty remarkable to have this book. And here's a picture of what Inez Kaiser looked like back then. So of course, in the telling of a diverse PR history, we can't forget about the women. Now, since Bernays is generally referred to as the father of PR, we call his wife Doris Fleischman Bernays the mother of public relations, and she's a wonderful writer. We have a lot of original works from her in this space here, which again, we need to digitize so more people have access to her writing. But one very important woman was Muriel Fox. And here's a picture of Muriel Fox with Betty Friedan. Muriel Fox was hired as the first professional writer at the Carl Bayer Agency in 1949. And in the late 50s, she met a woman named Betty Friedan, who in 1966 wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique. And they decided, you know what, women need an organization like the NAACP. We need an advocacy organization just for women. And so they decided to create the National Organization of Women. And this is the original press release. And you'll see here, the date line includes the National Press Club in Washington. So this is 1966. And this is the original, something else that we so much want to be able to digitize. I want to show you some very important materials that we got from Ophir Dukes' family. Ophir Dukes is best known for his work in civil rights. He was a counselor to Martin Luther King. He did a lot of press for the civil rights movement in the 60s. But toward the end of the 60s, he wanted to branch out. He opened up his own agency, and he got hired by Motown Records. So that's the plaque that you just saw. So this is something that Berry Gordy had created for him, that there are pictures there from Martin Luther King. There's also the Temptations, Supremes, Four Tops, all those great Motown bands. And Motown actually credits Ophir Dukes with bringing Motown to the mainstream. And we're very thankful for that, for sure. How much more time do I have left? Over 2 minutes. Okay, so you may have seen this picture. This is a very important picture, especially when we're talking about a seat at the table. You see, this here is Arthur Page, right? And his pipe that we showed you before is somewhere on this table. And Arthur Page was the first PR officer of AT&T. This picture he set up to showcase and to memorialize the second transatlantic phone call, which was done to Paris. So he had this map created, this graph, so that there was some explanation going on in the room, because he knew that this picture would make the papers. This is Griffiths, who was the CEO at the time making this call on a candlestick phone. So when we talk about PR people gaining a seat at the table, we are certainly talking about a guy like Arthur Page who dealt directly with the CEOs. Now, during the time before the Second World War, public relations was really held in much higher esteem than it is today. So in the 30s, public relations really boomed, which kind of seems counterintuitive because we had the Depression. But corporations actually took their money out of advertising because they knew that consumers were not going to be buying their products. So corporations invested in public relations in order to gain trust between the public and the company. And here's an article, where is it? Okay, sorry. They created a hierarchy, which
Sure, it's not in there.
no, I know it's in here. There's a hierarchy in here. First of all, this is a very important trade publication. And the first one, we're trying to find this hierarchy. But anyway, here it is. Sorry. Look at this hierarchy. So here you have the chairman, the president, and the director of public relations reporting into the president of the company. Now look how far down the advertising guy is, all the way down here. So you had publicity reporting to public relations. So this means that public relations as a function then served quite like a counselor, and publicity was just one of the tactics that a department did under him. So sales is all the way down there. The editors, the house organs were down there, and the advertising and marketing people were down there. So
Shelley.
Pretty incredible. Yep.
I was just going to say, it's very interesting that we've, gone back in time where, communicators really at the seat of the big seat at the table. Who knows where it all went wrong, but we'll save that for a discussion another day. But suffice it to say, public relations was way ahead of its time back when, and in understanding and respect from the heads of corporations. Thank you.
Oh, you bet. And I'll show you another thing to prove your point, Danny, is that Fortune magazine in 1939 ran a 20-page spread about the public relations industry. I think this is the first and the last positive story that Fortune magazine ever wrote about the industry, but they call it here an emerging, a fast-growing, emerging, new, and very important industry that everybody's got to look into and work with. So in this 20-page spread, which is something that, again, we need to digitize, he talks about various campaigns that different companies are doing. He's talking about the emergence of internal communications. It even has cartoons about public relations. And here you can see this cartoon here. It says, "Get me some of those public relations birds on the phone and ask them how much it will cost and how long it will take to get a corporation a soul." So various cartoons here about public relations. The Fortune people went ahead and created. Here's two women, one of them a switchboard operator. Ask that public relations man what to say when a customer asks, "Hey babe, how about Thursday night?" So of course this reveals a very sexist time as the video that you saw at the beginning of this program today. Oh yes, and people say to me, what is one of the most fun things that we have in the museum? Well, first of all, we have this cabinet here, and this cabinet belonged to Bernays. And you can imagine what a schlep it was to bring the cabinet down from Boston. In it, we have, I think the first thing you'll see here are 3 gold anvils, right? Here's one from Ophel Dukes. Here's the one to Harold Burson, and here's the one to Del Galloway. And but my favorite thing in here is one of the most important creative communications tools of the 1800s. This is called a stereoscope, and it's the early version of Viewmaster. I guess it's an early version too of VR. So during the 1800s, companies would produce these 3D photos, and this one is a very early version of porn. These are called Bathing Beauties of Coney Island. And this is what a lot of families used to look at in their parlors at night. These photos were also used for news events. We have one of Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration, et cetera, et cetera. So in the many years before television, this was one way that families could get some visual enjoyment. So that ends the formal part of our tour. And I wanted to leave time for you to meet somebody, another person on film that I think you'll find very interesting. And then I'll take some Q&A.
Right. Just give me a moment, please. Can you see my screen? All right, here we go.
When the late Ivy Lee in 1914 was retained by John D. Rockefeller, the profession of public relations came into being. Lee was convinced that the public could be brought to understand the aged oil magnate if it knew him not only as a business baron, but as a philanthropist and a human being. From the association, both client and counselor profited greatly and learned much.
Mr. Rockefeller listened to me patiently, pleasantly, and calmly until I'd finished my eloquent presentation of why he should do what we recommended. And then he turned to me and with a bland smile said, Mr. Lee, now tell me all the reasons you can think of why I should not do what you recommend.
All right, Shelley. Let's see if there's
So
any.
that was the only, this is the only known sound recording of Ivy Lee that exists in the world. It's pretty remarkable after all of this time of reading about him and studying him that we finally got hold of footage that has him speaking. And of course, he's speaking about his client, John D. Rockefeller and Rockefeller Jr. So I want to thank you again. Free to take questions right now and may not be able to answer some of them. I hope most of them. And I keep saying, you know, we need to digitize, we need to digitize. I think that you'll see here the treasures that we hold here in PR history that go back more than 100 years. And we do have a GoFundMe drive right now. If you care to support us, you can find that drive with a link on prmuseum.org or homepage. And with that, I'll turn this over to Danny and some questions.
All right, well, we do have some questions here. One question is, where can we easily find information online on the early notable women and Black professionals in school PR? You mentioned digitizing the museum resources, but are there websites or books you'd recommend for now?
Yes, if you go to our website, prmuseum.org, there is a whole section on the history of Black public relations, Black people in public relations, as well as women. We've done lots of stories about people like Inez Kaiser, Moss Kendricks, Ophel Dukes, Joseph Baker. There are lots of people that should be taught in the schools right now, lots of women and lots of minorities. We also, by the way, 6 times a year, we have diversity themed events that we hold. Now they're being done on over online. So we have a Black PR history event, we have women in PR history, we have Latino PR history, Asian American PR history, and LGBTQ people in PR history. So I think we're covering a lot of the bases now, but we're telling a much more diverse history of public relations.
Well, here's another question. Do you do your public relations in-house or do you use an outside firm? That's an interesting one, huh?
Well, you know the shoemaker shoes, right? We do our own. We have several social media channels. We do a lot of speaking to classes all over the world now over Zoom, but we probably need a lot more publicity than we're currently getting, I would say, because so often people say to me, I didn't know there was a Museum of Public Relations. And I bet a lot of you didn't know that either. So I think that, you know, shoemaker shoes, we should be doing a, you know, much better job doing publicity about ourselves. And I hope one day we'll be able to devote the time to do that. Barry and I too own a public relations agency. So that's our day job. This is really what we do on the off hours.
Let's see, someone wrote, let's see here. Could you use a teletype machine, which used to be used in the Pentagon News Office?
Oh, are
This
you
comes from
kidding?
Fred Lash.
Ah, my God, Fred Lash. Hi, Fred. We know Fred Lash. By all means, that would be amazing. Fred Lash, we love you. Thank you.
So I guess, Fred, I'll have to go to your house and pick up the machine and I'll drive it up to New York. Shelley promised me a sandwich at a deli.
I do want Fred to know that we have this book from the Navy after we did the whole program with them in September with the students at San Diego State.
And someone asked, what do you think is the biggest difference in PR now?
Than 100 years ago?
Yeah.
I think you could see today that public relations, when it first started through, I would say, the Second World War, was probably thought of in a much higher level than it is today. I don't know what happened. That's worthy of some scholarship right there. But today, I have seen it go increasingly and on a decline. And I think it is partly because of social media. I think, you know, at least the students that I've taught this year at NYU cling to social media. They don't even talk about making something newsworthy. They don't get what that is. They don't read newspapers. It to them is more like, if you want to get a placement, let's post it on Facebook. So they're not thinking in terms as how we were trained. Many of us were trained in journalism, right? I got my 2 degrees in journalism. Today, none of them are taking journalism. I asked a few of them this week, have any of you taken news writing? And they looked at me blankly, like, news writing? They're hardly taking media relations. So I just hate to blame social media for the decline in our reputation, but I have to say that it does exist.
All right. We're looking, and a lot of people are agreeing with what you just said. So spot on, spot on. There was a question earlier today about the portrait that's behind you. Did you say that painting was in which museum?
That's in the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian. So it's a picture that was painted the same day, and he's in a slightly different pose, but he's wearing the same clothing and he's in front of the bookcase. So if you log onto their site, you'll see a picture of him that looks just like this. This, of course, is the original from his house that we took back with us that day in 1995 after he passed away.
All right, let's see here. There's several people coming back to the question originally about, you know, having a seat at the table. You know, since it, and I'll quote here, since it's very rare for the director of PR now to sit so high in the corporate hierarchy, how did the function, or when did the function lose its credibility with the C-suite? I mean,
Yeah, it's
oh,
something that we don't know. And I often ask this question. We speculate. You know, after the war, there were a lot of GIs returning home. You know, names that we know today, like Fleischman and Edelman and Harold Burson, who created huge firms. And these firms were set up quite differently than the agencies were before the war. And so it is possible that agencies started relying on the product of publicity more than the counseling. And I think kind of that's what's missing today is like corporations may not be relying on us as much for counseling as they once did. Bernays would always say to us, you know, his client was the chairman of the company. He's never worked for anybody in-house. And of course, back then, there weren't that many PR people who worked in-house. They were mostly hired on the outside. So in every case, in every campaign that I know of between Ivy Lee and Bernays, and even the work of the first VPs of public relations, like Paul Garrett at GM and Arthur Page at AT&T, they reported directly into the C-suite. They were C-suite. So that's how public relations people were regarded. Now, when Bernays created his PR firm in 1919, he hung out a shingle that said Council of Public Relations. The reason he did that is because he wanted to give it higher stature and to differentiate himself from the, what he called flacks of the time, press agents. There were a lot of press agents for theatrical stars. And even Ivy Lee would talk about publicity, but he used publicity and propaganda and public relations all interchangeably. So I think that part of the reason is the reliance post-war on producing publicity for clients. And, to make money in these agencies, you hired younger people to get on the phone and pitch and place with editors. And so that became the main function, it seems, of public relations agencies in the 50s. And they went on from there. But, there are so many attempts now, especially with the Arthur Page Society, to gain back that respect and to have a seat at the C-suite. So only time will tell. And I think that so much of it depends on us attracting really brilliant people into this business. And looking at the current generation of students who are looking to get jobs, I'm pretty hopeful about that. We just have to train them that they have to start reading the newspaper and learning how to place stories in it and understanding what a newsworthy story is and how to create news for a client.
Right. I have a question for you, and maybe it's obvious to so many people, but you used the word before, flack. Public relations people are called flacks. Why do we think that is? Somehow I used to think it was actually a term that came out of World War II, when the planes would fly and, let's say the Allied planes would fly and they had these guns that would shoot up, flak, and they would be spread wide. And well, if they hit a plane, well, they downed it. So I guess I don't know, maybe I'm making this up, but I thought it had something to do with the idea of flak being spread wide and sometimes hitting its target. Maybe I just made up something. I don't know.
Maybe you have a very good imagination, Danny. I have no idea.
All right. If anybody knows the real answer, please put it in the chat. But it sounded good to me. Maybe I do have a career in public relations.
Maybe after all this, yeah.
Yeah. We have an interesting comment for you from Edwin Galvez. I'm involved in museum advocacy in the Philippines, and it would be great if the Museum of PR could be featured in our country's biennial museum summit to jumpstart the establishment of a PR museum here. Tell us a little bit about that and maybe what other countries have done.
Well, no other country yet has been able to do it, and I'll tell you why. Because, Barry and I did not plan on starting a museum, right? We just were kind of, it just kind of happened. We were thrown into it by Bernays because we couldn't say no to him. He gave us his stuff and we had to start a museum. We're obligated to. When I've been working with the PRCA in London about starting a museum. And the problem is that people think that they need to start a museum, raise money, and then from there get the artifacts. I think that's the opposite of what has to happen. I think you get some volunteers together who are really lovers of history to start saving this stuff right now because people are throwing out this stuff. And just kind of do it, associate with a couple of colleges' PR programs. Don't worry about the money yet. I mean, it does take money to move on. And then you have to become chartered by the by Filipino educational authorities, as we were chartered by the New York State Board of Regents, and you have to become a nonprofit. All that takes a lot of time and money, but you can do it even on a small scale. Just start small, collect the artifacts, throw out a social media question asking if anybody has artifacts, please drop them off here in my office, and let it grow organically. At the very beginning, 25 years ago, all we had was Bernays stuff. And this was even before the internet. And as soon as the internet came about, we created a kind of museum online because nobody was going to come out and just look at Bernays stuff, we felt. So we created a museum that featured Ivy Lee, Paul Garrett, Ophir Dukes, Moss Kendricks, and that you can still find online. That was done in 1998. So it's entirely possible in this day of digitization for the gentleman from the Philippines to do a digital museum at first, because in the days of COVID, nobody's going to come probably to see your museum live, but you do have to collect the artifacts before people throw them out.
I think we have enough time for two questions. Debbie Miller asked, do you have any memorabilia from D. Park Gibson?
Yes, we do. And that's something that we're planning on digitizing as soon as we possibly can.
And I guess our last question is, what do you think is the most important contribution of the Museum of PR? Is it there to promote the profession when PR wasn't a certain age?
I think that, I think we have a number of them is to preserve this history. I mean, we have here not just the history of public relations, but we have demonstrated how public relations has impacted history for the last 150 years, which is why we have newspapers from the early 1800s. We have suffrage newspapers, slavery newspapers, and we try anti-slavery newspapers, and we try always to show how public relations itself has been used for time immemorial for social advocacy and social justice. So I think that's a very important contribution for young people to see that you can do social advocacy if you get into the public relations business. I also think that showcasing the diverse heritage that we have that has not been shown in any textbook to date is a very, very important contribution, because if African-American students and all they see are a couple of white men in our history, they're not going to feel the connection that's so important that they feel when they meet in this museum with people like Ofield and Muriel Fox and Doris Fleischman and Inez Kaiser and all the rest.
It's fabulous. In fact, I'll just mention, Tom McMahon wrote back to me. He looked up the definition of flak in the dictionary. And it says, when you hear of someone catching flak, you're hearing a figurative extension of a term used for anti-aircraft guns or for the shells fired from them. The noun is a publicity agent, and a verb is to publicize or promote something or someone.
Interesting.
Who knew? So we have, let's see, we have, we have 2 or 3 more minutes. Shelley, on your wall, choose something that you haven't spoken to us about, showed us yet, that might be of real interest. A last piece.
Oh, okay. This is the press release done by Bill Marsteller and Harold Burson on the formation of Burson Marsteller in February 1953. So this is the original. You'll notice it's the original, but it was also a carbon copy. And you know, we have it here framed. It's very, very important to us to have this here. We're very proud of it because Harold Burson himself handed this to us and said he wanted us to keep it for him. So this is something that, again, we want to digitize and make it available for the whole world to see.
That's great. And, you know, I have to say there's been a lot of communications in the chat room, you know, additional information that people have been commenting on. So I hope that our viewers today have been reading what some of our own sort of industry experts have been mentioning. There's a lot of great conversation going on. What could I say? But I just have to say that this was, I hope for everybody, an amazing tour of the Museum of Public Relations. And I can't thank you, Shelley, enough for this tour. And I also would like to say thank you behind the scenes to Barry Spector, co-founder of the museum, and associate curator, Jenny Frankel. I'd also like to thank Brian Taylor of the National Press Club for having set things up today. Say hello, Jenny. And again, visit the museum online and also visit the National Press Club at press.org to learn more about the events that are open to the public, breaking news events with speakers, headliners, but also for what the communicators are putting on, and join members. Membership will be so invaluable. Again, we can't thank you enough for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in person when we're out of the pandemic, and we'll see how many people we could fit in the museum at one time. Thank you. And to everybody, please stay safe, healthy, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone.